The bright California sun has a peculiar way of casting the darkest shadows, especially over the hills of Hollywood. We all know the image: the square jaw, the reassuring smile, the iconic red and blue suit standing tall against the black and white static of our childhood television sets. He was the man of steel, a beacon of truth and justice, who seemed entirely invulnerable to the passing of time and the trials of mortal men. But beneath that famous cape, behind the confident gaze that captivated millions of wide-eyed kids across America, there was a classically trained actor, a man of immense talent and quiet dignity, who found himself trapped inside a monument of his own making. Today, we look beyond the Metropolis skyline. We step away from the comic book panels and the Saturday morning reruns to explore the real, complex, and deeply human journey of George Reeves. It is a story of profound irony, a tale of a gifted performer who reached the absolute pinnacle of global recognition, only to find that very fame acting as a heavy, unbreakable chain. We are dedicated to preserving the true stories of the golden era. Your subscription is what keeps these legends alive. Before the television antennas began to sprout on every rooftop in the country, before the studios realized the immense power of the small screen, George was a young man with pure theatrical ambitions. Born George Kiefer Brewer, he cultivated a deep love for the craft of acting. Far from the flashy gimmicks of episodic television, he honed his skills in the hallowed halls of the Pasadena Playhouse, the very same proving ground that shaped legends of the craft. He was a serious actor, dedicating countless hours to the rhythm of the stage, the emotional weight of classical drama, and the gritty realism that was beginning to take hold of the industry. Much like the brooding intensity found in a Humphrey Bogart picture, or the sharp, uncompromising dramatic edge of an Ida Lupino production, Reeves's early career was rooted in a profound respect for serious, nuanced storytelling. He did not want to be a caricature. He wanted to be an artist. When he finally caught the eye of the major studio scouts, his trajectory seemed destined for the silver screen's highest honors. Just think about his cinematic debut. He did not start in forgotten B-movies or uncredited crowd scenes. His first major appearance was in the grandest, most magnificent epic ever committed to celluloid at the time, 1939's Gone with the Wind. Playing Stuart Tarleton, he stood right there on the porch of Tara, sharing the screen with the mesmerizing Vivien Leigh. He was young, handsome, and bristling with a charming Southern arrogance. The industry whispered his name. He was placed under contract with Warner Brothers, co-starring alongside titans like James Cagney in The Strawberry Blonde, and later holding his own opposite Merle Oberon in Lydia. He even shared the screen with the rugged Victor Mature in The Shanghai Gesture, a testament to his ability to stand shoulder to shoulder with the defining leading men of the era. He was steadily building a resume of prestige, a portfolio of character-driven performances that proved he was capable of carrying the emotional core of any picture. During the Second World War, he served his country with honor, joining the United States Army Air Forces, performing in the Broadway hit Winged Victory, and appearing in essential training films. He was a patriot, doing his part while putting his burgeoning career on hold. When he returned to civilian life, he expected the studio gates to swing wide open, to resume the dramatic ascent he had so carefully planned. But Hollywood, as many of the greats have learned the hard way, has a very short memory. The post-war landscape had shifted, the contracts were drying up, and the once promising leading man found himself fighting for scraps in a town that constantly demanded the next fresh face. And then came the offer that would alter the course of his existence forever. A chance to lead a new, unproven medium, television. It was viewed by the elite studio executives as a step down, a graveyard for fading stars. But it paid the bills, and George, always a working actor, took the job. He stepped into the boots of the ultimate hero, never suspecting that the suit would become a second skin, one he could never, ever shed. When Adventures of Superman premiered in the early 1950s, the television landscape was like the Wild West, uncharted territory with unwritten rules. George took the role of Clark Kent with a heavy heart, believing it would be a brief, forgotten stint. Just a quick paycheck to tide him over until a real dramatic picture came along. After all, they filmed the first 26 episodes in a grueling, frantic rush, often completing 2 shows a week on a shoestring budget. The costumes were heavy and hot, the flying harnesses were physically agonizing, and the financial compensation was surprisingly meager for a man who was about to become the face of an entire generation. But then, the broadcast hit the airwaves, and the world shifted on its axis. The success was immediate, absolute, and overwhelming. Children across America were captivated, glued to the flickering screens, watching their hero bend steel bars and leap across the painted skies of California sound stages. George Reeves was no longer just an actor. He had been elevated to the status of a living myth, a towering figure of morality for a post-war nation seeking comfort and clear lines between good and evil. He was beloved, adored by millions of young fans who saw him not as a performer playing a part, but as the genuine article. But inside the studio gates, in the boardrooms where careers are made and broken, that very adoration became a slow, suffocating poison. Hollywood executives are notoriously pragmatic and often deeply cynical. They looked at George and no longer saw the talented leading man from the Pasadena Playhouse. They no longer remembered the nuanced performance opposite Vivien Leigh. All they saw was the cape. They feared that audiences would never accept him as a troubled detective, a romantic lead, or a complex villain. Because the moment he stepped onto the screen, the illusion would shatter. The typecasting was brutal and unrelenting. He was effectively blacklisted from the serious, dramatic roles he so desperately craved. Tell us in the comments, from which city or neighborhood theater do you keep your fondest memories of Saturday matinees? Those memories are the foundation of our shared history. The ultimate heartbreak of this professional cage came in 1953. When George landed a role in the prestigious Oscar-winning picture. From Here to Eternity, it was supposed to be his glorious return to the silver screen, a chance to prove his dramatic weight alongside Burt Lancaster and Montgomery Clift. He played Sergeant Mahlon Stark, delivering a solid, grounded performance. But the legend of the cape preceded him. During test screenings, urban legend dictates that audiences murmured and pointed, whispering, "There's Superman," when he appeared in uniform. Whether the reaction was truly disruptive or simply the paranoid fear of the studio executives, his part was drastically reduced in the final cut. The message from the industry was cold and clear. You belong to the children now. You belong to the small screen. He was a prisoner of his own phenomenal success, forced to smile through public appearances, wearing the heavy wool suit at state fairs and department stores, earning a fraction of what traditional movies and all-stars commanded. all while the golden age of cinema moved on without him. The frustration began to build, a quiet desperation that gnawed at the edges of his dignity. But George was a gentleman. He never took his bitterness out on the fans. He maintained the illusion for the kids who looked up to him with shining eyes, carrying the unbearable weight of a hero's mantle, even as his own dreams were slowly turning to ash in the California sun. And as the doors of the major studios closed, he found himself walking down a different, far more dangerous path, seeking solace in the hidden, glamorous, and often treacherous social circles of Los Angeles, where power, passion, and danger walked hand in hand. Hollywood in the 1950s was a town built on beautiful illusions, but behind the velvet curtains, it was operated by men of ruthless pragmatism, and no one was more feared or more powerful than Eddie Mannix. He was the legendary general manager of MGM Studios, a man whose primary job was to bury the scandals of the stars, to keep the pristine image of the studio completely spotless. Mannix was the ultimate fixer, a man who knew where all the secrets were hidden, because, as the whisper suggested, he often locked the vault himself. To cross Eddie Mannix was professional ruin, and sometimes something far more permanent. Yet George Reeves found himself pulled into the very center of the Mannix empire, not through a studio contract, but through a perilous, intoxicating romance. He caught the eye of Toni Mannix, Eddie's wife. She was a former Ziegfeld showgirl, older than George, fiercely intelligent and immensely wealthy. Their connection began as a quiet affair, but quickly blossomed into an open secret among the Hollywood elite. It was a dangerous game of shadows, playing out under the bright Californian sun. Eddie Mannix, curiously, tolerated the arrangement. His marriage to Toni was an unconventional alliance, built on mutual understanding and separate lives. But while Eddie may have turned a blind eye, the psychological toll on George was immense. Toni showered him with extravagant gifts. She bought him a magnificent home in Benedict Canyon. She provided luxurious cars. She practically funded the lifestyle that the producers of his television show refused to pay for. But gold, no matter how brilliantly it shines, can still be forged into a cage. For a man of George's pride, a classically trained actor who desperately wanted to stand on his own 2 feet, relying on this arrangement was a bitter pill to swallow. He was living a double life. By day, he was the incorruptible hero, lecturing children on honesty and the American way. By night, he was entangled in a deeply complicated, emotionally draining triangle with the royalty of the studio system. Toni was intensely devoted, but her devotion bordered on a suffocating possessiveness. She loved him, yes, but she also controlled the parameters of his existence. As the years dragged on, the heavy wool suit felt tighter, and the golden cage grew smaller. George began to seek a way out, a desperate bid to reclaim his independence, both professionally and personally. He wanted to direct, he wanted to break the chains of the cape, and most dangerously of all, he wanted to break away from Toni. He began to distance himself, seeking the company of others, ultimately finding himself in the orbit of a younger, highly volatile socialite named Lenore Lemon. It was a drastic shift. You do not simply walk away from the wife of Eddie Mannix without facing the storm. The absolute fury of a Hollywood queen scorned was legendary, and the skies over Benedict Canyon were about to turn incredibly dark. The dawn of June 16, 1959, arrived with a heavy, suffocating silence over the hills of Los Angeles, a silence that would soon be shattered by a headline that brought an entire nation to tears. The official story, hastily assembled by the LAPD and readily accepted by a studio system eager to move on, was tragically simple. They claimed that George Reeves, despondent over his stalled career and the inescapable shadow of his television persona, chose to end his own journey. The case was closed with remarkable speed, a neat, tidy conclusion for a town that specialized in tying up loose ends. But for those who knew him, and for those who have dared to look closer at the shadows surrounding that night, the official narrative is full of impossible contradictions. Let us step into the room, not with morbid curiosity, but with the sharp eye of an investigator. The physical evidence left behind in that Benedict Canyon home tells a vastly different story than the one printed in the morning papers. First, there is the weapon itself, a Luger found near his body. Incredibly, the authorities found absolutely no usable fingerprints on it, not even his own. A pristine weapon at the scene of a sudden, chaotic, and final decision. Furthermore, the trajectory of the incident defied basic logic. The physical mechanics of what occurred simply did not align with a man acting alone in a moment of despair. Then we must consider the strange, unexplained marks on his body. Bruises that hinted at a struggle before the fatal incident took place. The local authorities, perhaps intimidated by the invisible, powerful hands that guided the city, chose to ignore these glaring inconsistencies. The house itself was full of guests that night, including his new fiancée, Lenore Lemon, a woman whose behavior in the immediate aftermath was described by witnesses as bizarre, detached, and highly suspicious. She reportedly lingered downstairs, engaging in strange, casual conversations while the tragedy unfolded just a floor above. But the most chilling piece of this puzzle lies outside those walls, in the weeks and months leading up to that terrible night. George had been the victim of a relentless, terrifying campaign of harassment. Ever since he had made the fateful decision to sever ties with Toni Mannix, his life had become a waking nightmare. He experienced sudden, inexplicable car accidents, the steering mechanism of his vehicle mysteriously failing on a treacherous mountain road. He received silent, menacing phone calls at all hours of the night, and his beloved dog, a quiet companion in a loud world, was suddenly and cruelly taken from him. These were not random acts of misfortune. They were the classic, unmistakable hallmarks of a sophisticated intimidation campaign. The kind of campaign orchestrated by people with the resources, the power, and the terrifying reach of the studio fixers. Eddie Mannix was a man who solved problems for a living, and George Reeves, a beloved idol who had publicly humiliated his fiercely possessive wife, had undoubtedly become a problem. The connections between the studio's inner circle and the organized syndicates that operated in the shadows of the city were well documented. It was an era where the lines between executive power and underworld muscle were often indistinguishable. The tragic end of George Reeves remains to this day one of the most agonizing mysteries of the golden era. A man who flew across our screens, grounded forever by a heavy, invisible hand. In the immediate aftermath of that tragic June morning, the vast, well-oiled machinery of the Hollywood studio system immediately sprang into action. There was no time for genuine mourning, no time for a proper, transparent investigation. The priority, as it always was in the golden era, was to protect the product, and George Reeves, for all his humanity, had become a highly valuable product. The narrative of the heartbroken, failing actor was heavily promoted, distributed to the press corps with astonishing efficiency. It was a convenient story, one that neatly absolved the powerful figures of Los Angeles from any scrutiny. But for a man who had shared the screen with cinematic giants, who had poured his soul into the Pasadena Playhouse, this final script was the ultimate indignity. His home, once a symbol of his hard-fought success, was quickly cleared out. His personal belongings, his books, his scripts, swept away as if he had never existed. The industry of forgetting is a ruthless business, and Hollywood is its undisputed capital. They needed the children of America to keep watching the reruns, to keep buying the sponsored cereals. And a messy, unresolved scandal involving organized crime and studio executives would severely damage the bottom line. Therefore, the Man of Steel was quietly laid to rest, not with the grand, sweeping honors befitting a national hero, but under a heavy cloud of whispered rumors and closed-door agreements. His mother, Helen Besselow, never believed the official story. She spent the remainder of her life and a considerable amount of her own modest fortune hiring private investigators, desperately trying to pry open the sealed vault of Hollywood's secrets. She knew her son, she knew his resilience, his pride, and his absolute refusal to surrender. But her cries for justice were met with deafening silence. A wall of orchestrated indifference that even a mother's love could not break. The tragedy of George Reeves is not simply how he left this world. It is how the world chose to remember him. For decades, his immense talent as a dramatic actor, his nuanced performances in film noir and wartime epics, were entirely eclipsed by the shadow of the cape. The typecasting that had tormented him in life continued to imprison him long after he was gone. Documentaries and retrospectives often focused solely on the perceived curse of the role, painting him as a victim, a man broken by a television show. But this simplistic view strips him of his profound agency and ignores the very real, very dangerous forces that he dared to challenge in his final years. He was not merely a tragic figure. He was a man who stood at the absolute intersection of Hollywood's brightest illusions and its darkest realities. A man who tried to navigate a system rigged in favor of the house. We must look beyond the easy answers provided by the studio fixers to see the genuine human being who fought for his dignity in a town that specialized in selling it. Behind the tragic headlines and the cynical studio maneuvers, there is a truth about George Reeves that the executives could never erase, and that is the undeniable measure of the man himself. While the industry treated him as an expendable asset, those who worked alongside him, the men and women who stood on those cramped, sweltering sound stages, remembered a gentleman of extraordinary character. When you look past the cape, you find a quiet champion who fought his battles with an elegant, unwavering dignity. Consider his relationship with his co-stars. In an era where leading men routinely threw their weight around, George used his immense popularity as a shield for others. When a notoriously difficult director began to verbally abuse Neill, the lovely actress who brought Lois Lane to life, George did not hesitate. He brought production to an absolute halt, stepping between the director and his leading lady, making it abundantly clear that such behavior would not be tolerated on his set. He protected his own, and when the dark, paranoid clouds of the political witch hunts swept through Hollywood, threatening to destroy lives and careers overnight, George stood tall. Robert Shayne, the beloved actor who played Inspector Henderson, found himself caught in the terrifying crosshairs of the blacklist. The studio executives paralyzed by fear, were ready to fire him immediately. But George Reeves, fully aware of the risk to his own delicate standing, threatened to walk away from the show entirely if Shayne was let go. He risked his own livelihood to protect a colleague from the devastating machinery of political panic. That is the measure of a true hero, a man whose moral compass was not defined by a script, but by a profound sense of decency. He carried this immense burden with a weary smile, but he never, ever let that smile slip when he was in the presence of his young fans. He understood that, to millions of children, he was not just an actor, he was a symbol of hope, an unbreakable promise that good would always triumph over evil. He visited hospitals, he answered fan mail, and he treated every wide-eyed child with a gentle, profound respect. He may have hated the cage, but he never blamed the innocent souls who admired the golden bars. George Reeves was a classical artist, caught in the turbulent, unforgiving currents of a changing industry. He was a man who tasted the heights of Hollywood glamour and intimately knew the depths of its shadows. His sudden departure remains a stain on the conscience of a town that prioritized profit over humanity. But time, the great equalizer, has finally begun to wash away the studio spin. Today, we do not remember him merely as a victim or a man defined by a single costume. We remember a fiercely talented, deeply honorable performer who navigated a treacherous world with a quiet, enduring grace.